At 1:30 in the morning, I stood barefoot in the hallway of my own home while my daughter-in-law threw my clothes into a suitcase. Not folded them, not packed them carefully, threw them. A sweater landed on the floor. My late husband's blue cardigan fell halfway out of the suitcase. One of my old photographs hit the wall and slid behind a table. Then Melissa looked straight at me and said, "You have 10 minutes." I looked at my son. Daniel was standing 6 feet away. He wasn't angry. That was somehow worse. He looked ashamed, but he didn't move. "Daniel," I whispered, "you're letting her do this." He swallowed. Then he said the words that would stay with me for months. "Mom, we need some distance from you. Please stop contacting us." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. I was 72 years old. I had raised that boy. I had held his hand through his first day of school, waited outside the emergency room when he broke his arm, playing baseball paid for his college textbooks when he couldn't afford them, and sat beside his hospital bed when pneumonia nearly took him at 32. And now at 1:30 in the morning, my own son was asking me to leave my own house. I looked around the hallway, the framed photographs, the grandfather clock Robert had repaired 3 times, the brass lamp my mother had given me, the staircase where Daniel had once sat on Christmas morning shaking with excitement because he thought Santa had forgotten him. Everything was still there, everything except the feeling that I was home. I took a slow breath. "All right," I said. Melissa stopped moving. Daniel looked surprised. Maybe they had expected tears. Maybe they had expected me to beg. Maybe they had expected the woman who had spent her entire life keeping peace in the family to finally lose control. But I had learned something after my husband died. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has finally understood everything. I walked toward the suitcase. Melissa stepped aside. I picked up Robert's cardigan and carefully folded it over my arm. Then I looked at my son. "Before I leave," I said, "I have one question." Daniel frowned. "What?" I pointed toward the staircase, toward the rooms we had filled with 40 years of memories. "Who told you this mansion was yours?" Daniel's face changed, just for a second. But I saw it. Melissa saw it too. And that was when I knew this wasn't really about distance. It was about the house. The house Robert and I had bought when Daniel was 17. The house everyone suddenly seemed to believe belonged to them. But to understand why my son was standing there at 1:30 a.m., asking his mother to disappear, you need to understand what happened long before that night. My story began with love. It began with a family, and like many family disasters, it began with something that seemed harmless. After Robert died, the house became painfully quiet. We had been married for 48 years. For nearly half a century, I had heard his footsteps coming down the stairs every morning. I knew the exact sound of his coffee mug touching the kitchen counter. I knew how he whistled when he couldn't remember the words to a song. Then one winter morning, there was simply silence. I won't pretend I handled it well. I didn't. For several months, I barely wanted to leave the house. Daniel worried about me. He started coming over on Sundays with Melissa. At first, I was grateful. They brought groceries. They fixed little things around the house. Melissa would make coffee and sit with me at the kitchen table. She often told me, "You shouldn't be alone here." I thought she was being kind. One Sunday, while we were eating lunch, she looked around the dining room and smiled. "This place is beautiful," she said. "It took us 30 years to make it feel like home," I replied. She nodded. "It's going to stay in the family though, right?" I laughed softly. "I certainly hope so." Daniel smiled. Melissa smiled too. I didn't think anything of it. That was my first mistake. Over the next year, Melissa began saying things that sounded like jokes. "We'll have to repaint this room when we move in." Or Daniel could turn that basement into a workshop. Or this kitchen would be perfect with an island. I would laugh and remind her I'm not planning on moving anytime soon. She would laugh back. "Of course not." But her questions became more specific. "What happens to the house if you get sick? What did Robert put in his will? Did he leave everything to you? Have you decided what Daniel gets?" I answered some questions. I ignored others. Eventually, I told her that Robert and I had always believed in keeping our estate documents private. That was when her smile changed. It was barely noticeable. But I noticed. A few months later, I met with an attorney and updated my estate plan. Robert and I had discussed it many times before his death, but I wanted everything reviewed carefully now that I was alone. The house remained mine, my accounts remained mine, and Daniel would be provided for according to the plan I had created. But I had never promised him immediate ownership of my home. Not once. I never told him the mansion belonged to him. I never signed it over. I never promised that he could move in. And I certainly never agreed that someone else could decide when I should leave. Yet somehow, by the time Melissa began packing my bags, my son seemed convinced that I had broken a promise I had never made. That night, standing in the hallway, I finally understood something. They hadn't suddenly decided they didn't want me in their lives. Someone had been telling them a story about my money, a story about my house, a story about what they believed they were entitled to. And if I wanted the truth, I was going to have to find out who had written that story. I picked up my suitcase. I walked toward the front door. Neither of them stopped me, but before I stepped outside, I turned around one last time. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. Melissa folded her arms, and I said quietly, "You may regret making me leave tonight." Then I opened the door. Not because I was defeated, because I had finally decided to stop fighting the wrong battle. I was leaving the house, but I wasn't leaving my dignity, and I certainly wasn't leaving my rights behind. The hotel room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and stale coffee. I sat on the edge of the bed with my suitcase beside me, still wearing the clothes I had on when Melissa threw me out. I hadn't cried. Not yet. Maybe that was because the shock was still too fresh. Or maybe because somewhere deep inside me, I knew that if I started crying, I might not stop. I looked at the clock. 2:17 a.m. My phone sat on the nightstand. No messages from Daniel. No missed calls. Nothing. My own son had watched me walk out of my home in the middle of the night and hadn't even asked where I was going. That hurt more than the suitcase. I picked up the phone and almost called him. My thumb hovered over his name. Then I remembered his words. "Please stop contacting us." So I put the phone down. "All right, Daniel," I whispered into the empty room. "You asked for distance." I took a breath. "You're going to get it." But sleep didn't come. Instead, my mind went backward. Back to the house. Back to Robert. Back to the beginning. We bought that property 38 years ago. At the time, it wasn't the impressive home everyone called a mansion. It was an aging 2-story house on nearly 2 acres, with peeling paint, a cracked driveway, and a kitchen so small that 2 people couldn't stand in it without bumping elbows. Robert loved it immediately. I didn't. I remember standing on the front porch with the real estate agent while Robert looked through the windows. He turned to me and said, "Evelyn, I can see it." "See what, our life?" I laughed. "You see a life with a leaking roof." He grinned. "I see potential." That was Robert. He could look at something broken and imagine what it could become. We bought the house. Then we spent decades making it ours. Robert built the bookshelves in the study himself. He planted 2 maple trees near the driveway when Daniel was still a teenager. I painted the dining room 3 different times because I could never decide on the right shade. Every room collected memories. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon every Christmas morning. The basement became Daniel's teenage hangout. The upstairs bedroom at the end of the hall was where Daniel studied for his college exams. There were dents in the hallway walls from moving furniture. There were pencil marks inside a closet showing Daniel's height from age 10 to 18. There was even a tiny scratch on the kitchen floor from the day Robert dropped a cast iron pan and pretended nothing had happened. That house wasn't simply an asset, it was our family history. After Robert died, it became my anchor. That was why I welcomed Daniel and Melissa when they began coming over more often. At first, Melissa was wonderful. She brought casseroles. She organized Robert's memorial flowers. She told me I was like a second mother to her. When I had trouble sleeping, she called to check on me. I trusted her. Then the comments began. One afternoon, we were sitting in the living room. Melissa looked around and said, "I can't imagine this place without you here." I smiled. "Neither can I." She laughed. "I'm serious. It's beautiful." Daniel was looking through an old photo album. Melissa leaned toward him. "Your parents really built something special." Daniel nodded. Then she said casually, "Someday you'll have all this." Daniel didn't answer. Neither did I. I remember thinking it was simply the normal way families talked about inheritance. I was wrong. A few months later, Melissa began talking about renovations. She suggested opening the kitchen. She wanted to replace the old cabinets. She thought the basement should become a guest suite. I told her I liked the house the way it was. She laughed. Of course you do. Then she added, I'm just thinking about the future. The word stayed with me. Future. Her future, not mine. One evening, Daniel came over alone. We sat on the back porch while the sun disappeared behind the trees. He asked me, Mom, have you ever thought about downsizing? I looked at him. Why you're alone here? I know. It must be a lot to maintain. It is. He hesitated. Then he said you could sell it and get something smaller. I smiled. I'm not ready. He nodded, but he didn't smile. I remember that clearly. At the time, I thought he was worried about me. Later, I wondered whether he was worried about something else. The questions became more frequent. What did Robert leave me? Did I have a trust? Was the house paid off? Who was my executor? What would happen if I became sick? Who would make my financial decisions? I tried to answer without becoming defensive. But eventually I said, Daniel, your father and I had an estate plan. Everything is documented. He said, I know. Melissa, sitting beside him, added, we're just trying to understand. I nodded. There's nothing wrong with understanding. But you don't need to manage it. She smiled, of course. Again, I believed her. Then Robert's birthday came. I was sitting alone in the study looking at an old photograph of him. I decided it was time to make sure my documents were completely current. So I called an attorney named Margaret Hayes, whom a friend had recommended. Margaret was practical, direct, and patient. She reviewed everything. My will, the deed, my financial accounts, the trust documents Robert and I had created. She explained that because I was alive and legally competent, the house remained under my control. Daniel had no present ownership interest simply because he was my son. That seemed obvious to me. I never imagined I would one day have to defend something so obvious. Margaret also helped me clarify what would happen to the property after my death. Daniel would be provided for. My grandchildren, if I ever had any, would be considered. Certain personal belongings would go to specific family members. Everything was written down, clear, legal, documented. I left her office feeling relieved. I thought I had protected my family from confusion. I didn't realize I had protected myself from them. Over the next year, Melissa's attitude changed. She stopped asking me directly about the estate. Instead, she began making statements. Daniel deserves this house. He's your only son. Robert would have wanted him to have it. That last one hurt. I finally told her, Melissa, don't tell me what my husband wanted. I was married to him for 48 years. She went quiet. Then she apologized. But the damage was done. Not long afterward, Daniel began repeating things she had said. One evening, he told me, Mom, I don't understand why you're making everything so complicated. I'm not. You keep saying the house is yours. I stared at him. Because it is. He sighed. You know what I mean. No, Daniel. I don't. He looked frustrated. Then he said something that I didn't understand until much later. You promised Dad would leave it to me. I felt a chill. Your father never promised you my house. Daniel looked away. I asked him where he had heard that. He didn't answer. Melissa appeared in the doorway. She put her hand on his shoulder. Let's just go. And they left. That was the first time I realized there was another version of my own family story being told behind my back. A version where I was selfish. A version where I was confused. A version where my house had somehow become my son's inheritance before I was even gone. But I still didn't understand how far the lie had spread. I didn't know that Melissa had already begun referring to the property as their future home to friends. I didn't know Daniel had started planning around it, and I certainly didn't know that by the time they packed my bags, they believed they were taking possession of something that had never belonged to them. The night I left, I thought I was walking away from a family argument. I was wrong. I was walking into a fight over my home, and the person who started it was about to reveal herself. The first morning after I left my house, I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. Then I saw the unfamiliar curtains, the hotel lamp, my suitcase on the floor, and everything came rushing back. Melissa packing my clothes, Daniel standing silently, the front door closing behind me. I sat up slowly. My first instinct was to call my son. I wanted to hear him say that he was sorry. I wanted him to tell me there had been some terrible misunderstanding. Most of all, I wanted him to say, "Mom, come home." But my phone remained silent. So I made coffee from the little machine beside the television and sat near the window. Outside, people were beginning their ordinary mornings. Cars pulled out of parking spaces. A woman walked a golden retriever along the sidewalk. A man in a suit hurried toward his car with a travel mug in his hand. The world had continued. That was the strange thing about heartbreak. Your entire life could feel like it had collapsed, and everyone else still had to get to work. I looked at my phone again. There was one message. From Daniel. My heart jumped. I opened it. It said, "Please respect what we asked. We need space." That was all. No apology, no explanation, just a boundary he had apparently decided I needed to obey. I put the phone face down. "All right," I whispered. Then I remembered something Melissa had said the night before. "You don't get to decide everything anymore." At the time, I hadn't understood what she meant. Now I did. She wasn't talking about my family. She was talking about my property, my money, my decisions, my future. And suddenly I wasn't interested in guessing anymore. I called Margaret Hayes. She answered on the second ring. "Evelyn." Her voice immediately made me feel steadier. "I'm sorry to call so early." "It's 7:30, she said. "You're fine." What's happened? I told her everything. The bags, the accusations, Daniel's words, the question about the mansion. Margaret didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a short silence. Then she asked, "Did they physically force you out?" "No." "Did they threaten you?" "No." "Did you leave voluntarily?" "I did." "That was probably wise," she said. "But now we need to determine why they believed they had the authority to do this." I closed my eyes. "That's what I want to know. Bring me your current estate documents. I have copies. Good. And bring your deed bank statements, insurance information, and anything else related to the property." I hesitated. "Margaret, do you think they're trying to take my house?" "I don't know yet." Her voice became more serious. "But I think we should find out before we assume anything." That afternoon, I walked into Margaret's office carrying a folder. I had been there many times before, but this time felt different. I wasn't there to plan for the future. I was there to protect the present. Margaret spread the documents across her desk. She checked the deed first, then the trust, then the amendments, then the dates. Finally, she looked up. "Evelyn, the property is still yours." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I know. I want you to hear me carefully," she said. "Your son does not own this house because he is your son. Your daughter-in-law doesn't own it because she is married to your son. And nobody acquires ownership because they believe they will inherit someday." I nodded. "That sounds obvious." "It is." She paused. "Which is why I'm concerned that they may have been given incorrect information." I remember Daniel's face when I asked who told him the mansion was his. That flicker of fear. That moment when he looked at Melissa. I told Margaret. She leaned back. "That's important." "Why?" "Because if Daniel genuinely believes the house belongs to him, someone has convinced him of something very different from what's in these documents." I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. "I have something else." I showed her the text messages Melissa had sent over the previous several months. At first, they seemed harmless. "We should talk about the house. Daniel is worried about you. You can't maintain that place forever." Then they became sharper. "You need to think about the future. Daniel has a right to know what you're planning. And finally, don't make this harder than it has to be." Margaret read them carefully. "Have you ever told Melissa she could move into the house?" "No." "Have you ever promised Daniel the house?" "No." "Have you signed any transfer documents?" "No." "Have you added either of them to the deed?" "No." Margaret nodded. "Then we have a very different problem." "What kind?" "Family manipulation." The words made my stomach tighten. I thought about every Sunday lunch, every casual question, every comment about renovations, every time Melissa had said our future home. I had mistaken persistence for affection. Margaret continued reviewing the paperwork. Then she stopped. "There's something else." "What, your financial records?" I frowned. "What about them?" "Did Daniel ever ask to be added to one of your accounts?" "Yes." "When?" "About 6 months ago." "Did you agree?" "No." "Why did he ask?" "He said it would make things easier if something happened to me." Margaret looked at me. "Did Melissa ask similar questions?" "Yes." "Did either of them ever have access to your online banking?" No passwords, no power of attorney? No, she nodded. That's good. Then she asked another question. Have you noticed any missing documents? I thought about it. At first I couldn't think of anything. Then I remembered the study, Robert's old desk, the filing cabinet. I had noticed one folder missing several weeks earlier. I had assumed I had misplaced it. What folder? An old folder containing copies of Robert's estate documents. Margaret's expression changed. Did you find it? No, call me if you do. I promised I would. Before I left, she gave me one more instruction. Don't argue with Daniel. I wasn't planning to. Don't explain yourself over text. All right, and don't threaten Melissa. I almost laughed. Margaret, I have no intention of threatening anyone. I know. I'm telling you because people make mistakes when they're hurt. She looked directly at me. Your strongest position right now is calm. I thought about that all the way back to the hotel. Calm, documentation, boundaries. Those words felt strangely powerful. That evening I went through my phone again. I searched old messages, emails, photos, notes, and then I found something I hadn't seen before. An email from Melissa to Daniel. It was dated 3 months earlier. The subject line was Mom's house. I opened it. The message was short. Melissa had written that Evelyn was becoming difficult. She claimed I had told Daniel that I was going to leave the house to charity. That wasn't true. I had never said it. But there was another sentence that stopped me cold. Once she realizes she can't take it with her, she'll come around. I read it twice, then a third time. My hands began to shake. I kept scrolling. Another message. You have to stop letting her control you. Then your dad wanted you to have that place. And finally, if we don't stand up to her now, we'll never get it. I stared at the screen. There it was. The story. The one that had been growing behind my back. Melissa had turned my estate plan into a promise. She had turned my boundaries into manipulation. She had turned my home into something she believed she was owed. And she had convinced Daniel that standing against me was the same thing as standing up for himself. I put the phone down. For the first time since leaving my house, I felt something other than sadness. I felt clarity. I understood why Daniel wouldn't look at me. He wasn't completely sure. That was the weakness in the story. He believed it because he trusted Melissa. But part of him knew there were things that didn't add up. And I knew exactly where I needed to start. I called Margaret again. I found the emails. She was quiet for a moment. Save copies. I will. Don't delete anything. I won't. And Evelyn, yes. Whatever happens next, don't let anger make the decisions. I looked out the hotel window. The sky was turning orange over the parking lot. I won't. Then I smiled faintly. Because Margaret didn't know what I had just realized. I wasn't going to fight Melissa with anger. I wasn't going to beg Daniel to choose me. And I wasn't going to destroy my son's marriage. I was simply going to let the truth catch up with them. The house was mine. The documents were clear. And the story Melissa had told my son was beginning to fall apart. But I had no idea how much she had already done to make that lie real. By the next morning, I had made a decision. I was not going back to the house to argue. I was not going to stand on the porch and demand that Daniel choose between his mother and his wife. And I was not going to send Melissa an angry message no matter how badly I wanted to. Margaret had been right. Calm was my strongest position. So I checked out of the hotel, put my suitcase in the trunk of my car, and drove to my friend Carol's house. Carol had been my closest friend for more than 20 years. She opened the door, looked at my suitcase, and immediately knew something was wrong. Oh, Evelyn, that was all she said. I walked inside, then I cried. Not dramatically, not loudly. I simply sat at her kitchen table and cried the way an exhausted person cries when there is nothing left to hold inside. Carol made tea. She didn't ask me to explain everything. She already knew about Daniel and Melissa. After a while, she placed her hand over mine. You don't have to make any decisions today. I already made one. She looked at me. I'm going to protect myself. Carol nodded. That sounds like a good decision. Later that afternoon, I called Margaret. She had prepared a list of things I needed to review. The deed, the trust, my insurance, my bank accounts, my retirement accounts, my passwords, my powers of attorney, every document that mattered. I had always thought of estate planning as something you did once and put in a drawer. Robert and I had been careful. We had hired professionals. We had signed everything properly. But I had never imagined that one day I would need to prove to my own son that the house he grew up in was still mine. Margaret reminded me that there was another important distinction. You don't need to punish Daniel, she said. I know. You need to protect your rights. I understand. And you should not make changes simply because you're angry. I looked down at the papers. I won't. That was true. But there were a few things I needed to change immediately. First, I asked the bank to review my accounts for unauthorized activity. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been transferred. But I wanted everything documented. Second, I reviewed my passwords. Third, I confirmed that no one had been added to my accounts without my knowledge. Fourth, I asked Margaret to make sure my attorney records were secure. And finally, I asked about the house. What should I do about the locks? Margaret thought for a moment. If you are the legal owner and you are concerned about unauthorized access, have a licensed locksmith change them. Keep the receipts. Don't confront anyone. I nodded. That afternoon, I drove back to my neighborhood. I didn't go inside. I parked 2 houses away. My heart was pounding. The house looked exactly the same. The porch light was on. The curtains were closed. The maple trees Robert had planted were moving gently in the wind. For a moment, I felt like I was watching my own life from outside. Then I saw Daniel's truck. He was home. I almost got out of the car. Almost. Then I remembered what he had said. Please stop contacting us. So I drove away. That was harder than anything else. I didn't realize how much I had spent my life fixing things for Daniel. When he was 12, I fixed problems with teachers. When he was 22, I helped him find work. When he was 30, I helped him through a difficult divorce. When he became a father, I babysat whenever he needed me. When he struggled financially, I gave him money. I had always believed that was what mothers did. But somewhere along the way, helping him had become something he expected. And Melissa had learned to expect it too. That evening, I received another message. From Melissa, I hope you're safe. I stared at the screen, then another message arrived. We didn't want this to happen. I almost responded. Instead, I showed Margaret. She called me immediately. Don't answer. I wasn't going to. Good. Then Margaret said something that made me think. Evelyn, people sometimes become very careful with their words after they realize a situation may become legal. I looked at the messages again. I understand. Save them. I did. The next morning, I hired the locksmith. We met at the house. I stood outside while he changed the locks. It was strange. This was the place where Robert had once surprised me with a new front door, because he said the old one made the house look tired. Now I was standing there changing the locks because I no longer trusted my own family with access. When the locksmith finished, he handed me the new keys. I held them tightly. For the first time since leaving, I felt like I had reclaimed something. Not the house. The house had never stopped being mine. I had reclaimed my sense of control. Inside, I found several things missing. Some of my clothes, a few personal items, and the folder containing Robert's old estate documents was still gone. I called Margaret. I found the missing folder. Where it's not here. She became quiet. Evelyn, did Daniel ever have access to the study? Yes, many times. Did Melissa? Yes. Don't accuse either of them. I won't. Just document the fact that it's missing. I wrote everything down. Then I walked through the house, the living room, the dining room, the kitchen, Robert's study, my bedroom. Every room felt different. The night before, I had been a woman being pushed out. Now I was a woman standing in the house she had spent decades building. I walked upstairs and stopped outside Daniel's old bedroom. I could still remember him at 17, lying on the floor, surrounded by college applications. I remembered telling him, "You don't have to know everything today." He had looked at me and said, "What if I choose wrong?" I had answered, "Then you learn and choose again." I wondered if he remembered that. I wondered if he would ever understand that he had made a choice too. He had chosen to believe someone else's version of his mother. I went downstairs. There was one final thing I needed to do. I called the estate attorney again. I want to review everything. All right. I don't want to change my plan out of anger. I know, but I want it to reflect my wishes clearly. That is different. Yes. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing my documents. Margaret explained every section again. She asked questions. I answered them. We discussed what would happen if I became unable to manage my affairs. We discussed who should make medical decisions. We discussed financial authority. We discussed the house. And then Margaret said you should consider naming a neutral professional as successor trustee. I looked at her. Why? Because if your family is already arguing about the property, you don't want the person handling the trust to become part of the conflict? That made sense. I agreed. There was no revenge in that decision, only clarity. Before I left her office, Margaret handed me a copy of the updated instructions. Evelyn, she said, you need to understand something. What you are allowed to have boundaries with your adult child. I looked at her. She continued, you can love someone and still refuse to give them access to your finances. You can forgive someone and still protect your property. Those things aren't contradictory. I felt tears rise in my eyes, because that was exactly what I needed to hear. For years, I had confused being a good mother with always making things easier for my son. Now I understood that sometimes love meant refusing to make the wrong thing easy. That evening, I went home. I made dinner for one. I sat at the table where Robert and I had eaten thousands of meals. The house was quiet, but this time the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. My phone remained silent. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call Melissa. I didn't chase them. I didn't threaten them. I simply waited, because somewhere in that house they still believed they had won. They thought they had removed the obstacle between themselves and the mansion. They didn't realize the person they had pushed away was the only one who knew exactly what the legal document said. And soon Daniel was going to learn the difference between an inheritance and ownership. He was going to learn that being my son gave him a place in my heart. It never gave him a deed to my house. 3 days passed before Daniel called me. I was sitting at my kitchen table reading an old letter Robert had written to me when we were newly married. My phone rang. His name appeared on the screen. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I answered. Hello? There was silence. Finally, Daniel said, Mom. I closed my eyes. Yes, we need to talk. I almost laughed. You told me not to contact you. I know. And you told me you needed distance? I know. His voice sounded tired. Can I come by? I looked around the kitchen, the same room where he had eaten breakfast as a child, the same room where Melissa had once sat across from me and called this house beautiful. I said, you can come. He arrived 20 minutes later. He stood on the porch for a moment before I opened the door. He looked older than he had a week earlier. His shoulders were tense. His eyes were tired. Can I come in? I stepped aside. Yes. He walked into the living room. His gaze moved around the room. The photographs, the fireplace, Robert's old chair. For the first time, I wondered whether Daniel was seeing the house as his childhood home again, instead of the prize Melissa had convinced him it was. He sat down. I remained standing. Where's Melissa? I asked. She doesn't know I'm here. I nodded. What happened? Daniel rubbed his hands together. Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I looked at him. A misunderstanding doesn't explain why my clothes were packed into garbage bags at 1:30 in the morning. His face tightened. I know. Do you? He looked down. Then he said, I thought you had changed everything. Changed what, the estate? I stared at him. What exactly did you think I changed? He hesitated. Melissa said you were leaving the house to charity. I felt my chest tighten. I never said that. I know that now. I sat across from him. Who told you that, Melissa? There it was. The answer I had been waiting for. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Daniel, I said quietly, why didn't you ask me? He didn't answer. Why didn't you call me and say, Mom, I heard something about the house. Is it true? He looked at the floor. I thought you would lie. That hurt, more than anything else he had said. I whispered, you thought your mother would lie to you about her own estate? He closed his eyes. I don't know what I thought. Yes, you do. He looked up. You thought I was trying to keep something from you. He nodded. And you believed her. Another nod. I stood and walked to the bookshelf. I pulled out a folder. This is the current trust. Daniel looked at it. I don't want to read it. You should. Mom. No. I placed it on the table. You don't get to make decisions about my house based on something someone told you. If you want to understand, read the actual document. He stared at the folder. Finally, he opened it. He read silently. His face changed as he moved through the pages. I watched him realize things one sentence at a time. The house was mine. The trust did not give him present ownership. There was no promise that he could move in. There was no guarantee that the property would automatically become his, and there was certainly no provision allowing him to remove me while I was alive. Daniel stopped reading. This isn't what I was told. I know. He looked at me. Mom, Melissa said Dad wanted me to have this. Your father wanted you to be taken care of. That sounds like the same thing. It isn't. I sat beside him. Your father and I loved you. We wanted you to have a good life. But he never told me to give you my home while I was still living in it. Daniel looked toward the fireplace. I thought you were changing everything because you didn't trust me. I took a breath. Daniel, trust isn't something you demand because you're my son. He said nothing. It's something you earn by how you behave. His eyes became wet. I continued. You didn't trust me enough to ask me a question. You trusted someone else's story instead. He wiped his face. I was wrong. Those 3 words were the first honest thing he had said to me. But I wasn't finished. There is something else. He looked up. Your wife has been asking questions about my accounts. I know. I stared at him. You know, she told me, and you thought that was normal? He hesitated. She said she was trying to protect our future. I almost smiled. Your future. He looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry. I shook my head. Don't apologize because you're sitting in front of your mother and feeling guilty. Apologize when you understand what you did. He looked directly at me. I understand. Then tell me. He swallowed. I treated your house like it was already mine. I nodded. I believed I was entitled to it. Another nod. I let Melissa convince me that you were the problem. His voice broke, and I helped throw you out. The room became silent. I looked at my son. For the first time since that terrible night, I could see the little boy who had once been afraid of choosing the wrong college. The little boy who had once believed I could fix everything. But I couldn't fix this. Daniel had to. I forgive you, I said. His eyes filled with tears. Mom, but forgiveness doesn't mean nothing happened. He nodded. I know. It means I won't spend the rest of my life carrying anger toward you. He looked down. And what happens now? That depends on what you do. He looked surprised. I don't understand. I love you. That won't change. He nodded. But love doesn't mean you get unrestricted access to my home, my finances, or my decisions. I understand. Do you? Yes. I believed he wanted to, but wanting to change and changing were not the same thing. Before Daniel left, I gave him one more piece of information. Your father left you something. He looked surprised. What? A letter. I walked to the study. I had found it years ago in an old box. Robert had written it shortly before his death. I handed it to Daniel. He opened it. I watched his eyes move across the page. Robert had written about the house, but not as property, as a place where our family had grown. He wrote that if Daniel ever inherited the home, he should remember that a house was only valuable when the people inside it treated one another with love. Daniel started crying. I didn't know Dad wrote this. I did. He folded the letter carefully. Then he looked at me. Can I ask you something? Yes. Are you going to leave the house to me? I smiled sadly. That is exactly the question you should stop asking. He lowered his head. I know. If I leave it to you someday, it will be because I choose to. If I don't, that will also be my choice. He nodded. And you will respect that? Yes. Then we're finally talking about something real. After he left, I sat alone in Robert's study. I thought about how quickly a family could become divided when money entered the conversation. A house that had once held birthdays and Christmas mornings had become a battlefield. Not because the walls had changed, because expectations had. The next morning, Margaret called. I received a request from Daniel's attorney. I straightened in my chair. His attorney. Yes. What does he want to review certain estate information? I sighed. Is that legal, he can ask? Does he have a right to it? Not simply because he's your son. I nodded. Then Margaret said something that surprised me. Evelyn, there is another issue. What? The missing estate folder. My stomach tightened. We still haven't found it. No, then we need to determine whether someone removed it. I stared at the study door. Suddenly the problem was larger than I had realized. Because if someone had taken those documents, they hadn't done it by accident. Someone had been preparing. Someone had believed they needed information about my estate before confronting me. And I had a feeling that when the truth finally came out, Daniel wasn't going to be the only person who regretted what happened that night. I didn't hear from Daniel for almost a week. Part of me was relieved. Another part of me missed him. That was the cruelest thing about what had happened. Even after everything, he was still my son. I could be angry with him. I could be disappointed. I could refuse to let him control my life. But I couldn't turn off the part of me that remembered him at 8 years old, asleep against my shoulder during a thunderstorm. That part of me was still there. So when my phone finally rang, I answered. It wasn't Daniel. It was Margaret. "Evelyn, I need to tell you something." Her voice was careful. "What happened?" I received additional information from Daniel's attorney. I sat down. "What kind of information?" "There are financial records suggesting Daniel and Melissa made several decisions based on the assumption that they would eventually have the house." I frowned. "What decisions?" "Large purchases, renovation estimates, conversations with a lender." I stared at the wall. "Did they borrow against my house?" "No," I exhaled. "But they apparently believed they would eventually own it." I closed my eyes. That explained so much. The questions, the pressure, the urgency, the midnight eviction. They hadn't simply wanted my house. They had built a financial future around it. And when they realized I wasn't giving it to them, they treated me like the person standing between them and the life they thought they deserved. "Is Daniel in serious financial trouble?" I asked. "Possibly." I felt a strange sadness, not satisfaction, sadness, because I knew what came next. If their plans collapsed, they would need someone to blame, and I refused to be that person. That evening, Daniel came to see me again. He looked exhausted. He didn't bring Melissa. He didn't bring an attorney. He came alone. When I opened the door, he said, "Can I come in?" "Yes." He sat in the same chair as before. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Mom, I owe you the truth." I waited. "Melissa and I thought we were going to move here." I nodded slowly. "When eventually when he looked embarrassed. "After you decided to downsize?" I almost laughed, "which I never agreed to." "I know. And who told you I was going to Melissa?" "Again." "Her name hung between us." Daniel continued. "She said you had talked to her about it." "I didn't. I know that now." He rubbed his forehead. "We had already started making plans." "What kind of plans?" "Nothing official." "That isn't what I asked." He sighed. "We looked at contractors." I said nothing. "We talked to a lender." My heart sank. "Why?" "Because we thought we'd need money for renovations." I stared at him. "You were planning renovations for a house you didn't own." He nodded. "And you never thought to ask me. I thought it was already decided." By whom? He didn't answer. I didn't need him to. Then he said something that surprised me. "We also bought furniture." I looked at him. "For this house?" "Yes." I closed my eyes. For a moment I couldn't speak. I thought about the night Melissa threw my clothes into suitcases. She hadn't been acting like someone trying to remove an unwanted guest. She had been acting like someone preparing a house for herself. Daniel whispered, "I know how bad it sounds." "It sounds worse than bad." "I know." I looked at him. "Why didn't you stop her?" He looked down. "Because I wanted to believe it." That answer hurt, but it was honest. He wanted to believe that his future was already secured. He wanted to believe that the house would solve his financial problems. He wanted to believe that his mother's home could become his safety net. And because he wanted to believe it, he stopped asking questions. I said, "That's the part you need to understand." He looked up. "You didn't just believe Melissa. You believed what benefited you." His eyes filled with tears. Yes, there was no defense left. No excuse. Just the truth. He whispered, "I'm sorry." This time I believed him, but I wasn't ready to pretend everything was repaired. "Daniel, I love you. I love you too. But you can't come back into my life and act like nothing happened." "I won't. You need to earn my trust again." "I will. And Melissa." He looked away. "I don't know." That answer was honest too. I didn't tell him to leave her. I didn't tell him to stay. That was his decision. I had spent enough time trying to control other people's decisions. My own were enough. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small envelope. I found this. My heart stopped. I recognized it immediately. It was the missing folder. Where did you find it? He looked ashamed. In our garage. I stared at him. Why was it there? He hesitated. Melissa took it. My hands went cold. Why? She said she wanted to show me what Dad had left me. I looked at the envelope. Did she open it? I don't know. Did you? No, he handed it to me. I didn't open it, not yet. Instead, I asked, why did you bring it back? Because I finally realized it was never ours to take. That sentence broke something inside me. Not in a bad way, in a way that allowed me to breathe again. I took the folder. Thank you. He nodded. Then he stood. At the door, he stopped. Mom. Yes, do you think you can ever forgive me? I looked at him. I already told you I forgive you. His eyes filled. But I don't know how long it will take before I trust you again. He nodded. I understand. After he left, I called Margaret. She told me to preserve the folder and not alter anything. The next day, we reviewed the documents. Nothing had been changed. Nothing had been signed. Nothing had been transferred. But there was something else. A handwritten note was tucked inside. It wasn't Robert's handwriting. It was Melissa's. Only one sentence. Daniel deserves this. I stared at it. Then I handed it to Margaret. She read it carefully. This is useful, she said. Useful for understanding intent. I nodded, but I didn't feel victorious, because the truth was becoming uglier. Melissa hadn't misunderstood my estate plan. She had interpreted it in the way that benefited her, and then she had convinced Daniel to believe the same thing. That afternoon, Daniel called again. He said he had confronted Melissa. How did she respond? I asked. She said you had manipulated me. I closed my eyes, and I told her she was wrong. There was silence. Then he said she told me if you kept the house, we'd never get out of debt. I felt a wave of sadness. Daniel, the house was never supposed to get you out of debt. I know. You were supposed to build your own life. I know. His voice cracked. I forgot. That was the truth. Somewhere along the way, my son had forgotten the difference between receiving help and being entitled to it. I told him something my father had once told me. Money can make a family argue, but entitlement can make a family forget who they are. He was quiet. Then he said, I don't want to be that person anymore. I hope you mean it. I do. Over the next few weeks, Daniel began making changes. He and Melissa sold some of the things they had purchased. They met with a financial counselor. They stopped making plans around my property. And Daniel began paying back money I had previously given him, not because I demanded it, but because he said he wanted to learn how to stand on his own. That mattered to me. Not the money, the responsibility. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel came by with groceries. He didn't ask about the house. He didn't ask about the trust. He didn't ask what he would inherit. He simply said, you shouldn't have to carry all this yourself. I looked at him. I'm capable of carrying it. I know. He smiled. But maybe you shouldn't have to. For the first time in months, I smiled back. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. But because something had finally changed. Daniel was no longer looking at my house and seeing his future. He was looking at me and seeing his mother. And that was the beginning of reconciliation. 6 months after the night my bags were thrown by the door, I stood in my kitchen on a Sunday morning, stirring a pot of gravy while sunlight came through the windows. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the painful kind of quiet. It was peaceful. Robert's old clock ticked in the hallway. The maple trees outside had turned green again, and on the counter beside me was a handwritten grocery list. At the bottom in Daniel's handwriting were 3 words, "Don't forget pie." I smiled. It was such a small thing, but 6 months earlier, I couldn't have imagined seeing my son's handwriting in my kitchen without feeling hurt. Now I was getting ready for Thanksgiving. Not the grand family Thanksgiving we used to have. Not yet. This one would be smaller, careful, intentional. Daniel had asked if he and Melissa could come. I had thought about it for several days before answering. Eventually, I said yes. But I gave them conditions. No conversations about my estate. No questions about my accounts. No assumptions about the house. No going through my office or personal documents. And if anyone had a problem, we would talk about it honestly instead of letting resentment grow behind closed doors. Daniel agreed immediately. Melissa took longer, but eventually she agreed too. I wasn't pretending everything was healed. Trust doesn't return because someone says sorry. It returns because someone behaves differently over time. That morning, Daniel arrived first. He knocked. That mattered. The old Daniel would have walked in. This Daniel waited. I opened the door. He held a pie in both hands. "Apple," he said. I smiled. "Your father would have approved." He smiled back. I remembered. He stepped inside. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. Then he hugged me. It wasn't a dramatic embrace. It was quiet, awkward, real. I hugged him back. "It's good to see you, Mom. It's good to see you, too." He put the pie on the counter. Then he looked around. I noticed something. He wasn't looking at the walls. He wasn't measuring the rooms with his eyes. He wasn't imagining furniture. He was simply looking at me. "How have you been better?" "Really?" "Yes." He nodded. "Good." A little later, Melissa arrived. She stood on the porch holding a bouquet of flowers. When I opened the door, she didn't walk in immediately. She looked at me. "Can I come inside?" I nodded. "Yes." She handed me the flowers. "I brought these for you. Thank you." She took a breath. "I know I don't deserve your trust yet." I didn't answer. I know an apology doesn't erase what I did. Still, I said nothing. She continued. "I convinced myself that because Daniel was your son, the house would eventually belong to him, and because I believed that I started acting like it already belonged to us." I looked at her. She was crying now. "I was wrong." I took a breath. "You were." She nodded. "I know. I don't hate you, Melissa." She looked surprised. "But I don't trust you yet. I understand. And I don't know how long that will take. I understand that too." I stepped aside. "Come in." She wiped her eyes. Then she entered. That was enough for that day. We didn't need a perfect ending. We needed an honest beginning. During dinner, nobody mentioned the mansion. Nobody mentioned the trust. Nobody mentioned inheritance. Instead, Daniel told a funny story about his first job. Melissa talked about a recipe she had learned from her grandmother. I told them about the time Robert accidentally burned an entire Thanksgiving turkey because he had fallen asleep watching football. Daniel laughed. "I remember that. You were 12. I thought Dad did it on purpose." "He told you he did." Daniel laughed harder. For a few minutes, it felt like the old days. Not exactly. Something had changed, but maybe that wasn't always a bad thing. After dinner, Daniel helped me clear the table. He looked toward the hallway. "Can I ask you something?" I smiled. "If it's about the house, no." He laughed. "No?" Then he became serious. "I was wondering if you changed your estate plan." I looked at him. He immediately raised both hands. "Not because I want to know what I'm getting." "Good. I just wanted to know whether you got everything updated." I nodded. "I did." "Good. I also appointed a neutral professional to handle certain responsibilities if I'm ever unable to do so." "That makes sense." "And I reviewed my medical and financial powers of attorney." He nodded. "I'm glad." I looked at him. "You're not upset?" "No." He paused. "I think I understand now. Understand what that planning for your future isn't the same as planning for my inheritance." I smiled. "That took you a while." He laughed softly. "It did." Then he looked down. "I've been thinking about something." "What, you were right." I raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "When I was younger, you always told me that if I made a mistake, I had to learn from it." I nodded. "I remember. I thought being your son meant you'd always fix things for me." I didn't interrupt. "But this time you didn't." "No. And at first I thought you were abandoning me." I looked at him. "But you weren't." "No. You were letting me face what I had done." I nodded. "That was harder than anything you could have done." He looked at me. "Thank you." I reached across the counter and touched his hand. "You're welcome." Then I added, "But don't make me do it again." He smiled. "I won't." That evening after they left, I stood at the front door. The same doorway where my bags had been thrown 6 months earlier. I remembered that night, the fear, the humiliation, the anger, the question I had asked, "Who told you this mansion was yours?" I had thought that question would expose a lie. It did, but it also exposed something much deeper. I had spent years believing that being a loving mother meant making sure my son never struggled. I finally understood that love sometimes means allowing an adult child to experience the consequences of his own choices. My house was still standing. My marriage was still part of its walls. Robert's memory was still in the study. Daniel was still my son, but the relationship between us had changed, and maybe it needed to. Because reconciliation isn't going backward. It's building something new from what survived. A few weeks later, I met Margaret again. We reviewed everything one final time. The deed, the trust, the beneficiary designations, my powers of attorney, my instructions for the future. Everything was organized. Everything was documented. And for the first time, I felt completely at peace with it. Margaret closed the folder. "You've done what you needed to do." I smiled. I think I finally understand why people say estate planning is about more than money. It is. It's about making your wishes clear and protecting your ability to make those decisions. I nodded. That was the lesson I wished I had understood years earlier. If you are listening to my story and you're over 60, I want you to remember something. Don't assume your family understands your wishes. Don't rely on promises made around a dinner table. Don't put off reviewing your will, trust, beneficiary designations, or powers of attorney. And never let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting your home or your finances. Your children may be part of your legacy, but they are not entitled to control your life simply because they may one day inherit something from you. Ask questions. Keep important documents secure. Use qualified professionals. Make your wishes clear. And most importantly, remember that setting a boundary does not mean you stop loving someone. Sometimes a boundary is the very thing that gives love a chance to survive. Months later, Daniel came over one evening. He knocked on the door. I opened it. He was holding a bag of groceries. "Mommy said I was at the store. I remembered you like those peaches." I smiled. "Come in." He stepped inside. No questions about the house. No questions about money. No assumptions. Just my son coming home for dinner. And as I closed the door behind him, I realized something. That night when Melissa threw my bags by the door, I thought I had lost my family. But I hadn't lost my family. I had lost an illusion. The illusion that keeping peace meant keeping everyone happy. The illusion that love required me to surrender my boundaries. And the illusion that inheritance could guarantee loyalty. It can't. A house can be inherited. Money can be divided. Furniture can be given away. But trust is earned one choice at a time. And family isn't measured by who gets the keys. It's measured by who knocks. So if this story reminded you of someone you love, take a moment to think about what matters most in your own family. Maybe it's time to have an honest conversation. Maybe it's time to put your wishes in writing. Maybe it's time to forgive someone. Or maybe like Evelyn, it's simply time to remember that you are allowed to protect the life you worked so hard to build. If this story touched something in your heart, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've ever learned a difficult lesson about family inheritance or forgiveness, leave your thoughts below. Sometimes one person's story gives another person the courage to set a boundary, ask a question, or make peace before it's too late. Because in the end, the greatest revenge isn't watching someone lose what they wanted. It's discovering that you no longer need revenge at all. You have your dignity. You have your peace. And if you're fortunate, you may even have a family that finally understands the difference between loving you and being entitled to you. I closed the door that evening with Daniel inside my home. This time, no one was being thrown out. No one was packing bags. No one was claiming what wasn't theirs. There was only laughter coming from the kitchen. And for the first time in a very long time, the house felt like home again. The end.